All right, man, peace. So, brothers, this is going to be volume 1 in a new series that I'm starting called Woke Blacks Just Want That Hug from Daddy. And this will be featuring the two young toddlers whose video has created a viral sensation across the internet landscape as well as the social media sphere. When I saw this video, brothers, what first struck me was how transparent this silly attempt by the mainstream liberal media was to once again perform what I call toddler or child programming on the masses of the people. They're constantly trying to get people to believe that young children or toddlers think on a higher level, a more proficient level, or a more favorable level than adults do. Why is that? Because they understand that once they get you to embrace the emotional aspect of this quote unquote reality or society that we live in, which is not real or substantive in any way, it's going to be far easier for them to basically dog walk you in whatever direction they like. And look, I'm not trying to be a killjoy. You see two little kids run up to one another on the street, give each other a big hug. I get it. For those of you who might be parents out there or who love children, and everyone should love children because, not to speak in cliches, but children are the future. We all understand that. We all know that. But I always see things from a three-dimensional perspective. I cannot help it. That's just how my brain works. The first thing that I look for whenever I see an instance of toddler or child programming like this is who and what it reveals in people. And as I've always told you, brothers, since I've had this channel, pro-blacks are actually pro-white. And when I say pro-blacks, I'm not talking about the people who are actually for their people. I'm talking about the low-level internet revolutionary woke blacks who talk a real good one about the so-called white man. But in reality, what they're looking for is a validation of their own existence through forcing the so-called Caucasian man to give them attention, quote-unquote love, an apology, acceptance, all for the slave narrative that is taught in the school system and the fracturing of the quote-unquote black family structure. All these things have caused this very acerbic, very corrosive, very toxic connection between so-called blacks and whites. And just accepting the term black as a racial designation means that you're always going to be linked to so-called whites because you cannot have white without black and vice versa. That's why you'll notice that those two quote-unquote demographics or groups or races in America, they always seem to have a very unhealthy fascination with one another. The mainstream liberal media plays on this and is constantly trying to get those two forces to maintain their obsession with one another, because as long as that occurs, it's going to be very easy for those who are working behind the curtains to continue to reap the benefits of that toxic dysfunctionality. But let's just get to this video here, because as I stated, when I watched it and I read the comments in many of these videos, I check out the comment sections just to see what the video is able to reveal in the target audience, because it should tell you a lot. So of course, we're going to let this video play. They're going to talk about it and I'm going to chime in.
To an adorable moment between two toddlers in Washington Heights that's going viral. And here you can see why. Video captures two-year-old best friends Maxwell and Finnegan running to each other.
Now this is to help promote the quote-unquote American dream of the so-called black man and the so-called Caucasian man coming together in unity. They already know that this is not really going to happen. It's not meant to happen because it's not consistent with biblical prophecy. The reason why they try to propagate this notion is to keep both sides confused, particularly the so-called black race, the quote-unquote black race, and especially the so-called black man. Because they understand that the so-called black man and woman, and really all races of color, have been taught to place the Caucasian man on a pedestal. Even certain so-called races who are depicted as doing very well on a worldwide scale, like the Asians, they put the Caucasian on a pedestal as well. That's why it's easy to deduce who is in power. And each nation is put in power as a nation, and they're taken out of power as a nation. In order for the image of the so-called Caucasian to maintain that hallowed air that it currently occupies, they have to keep pushing this infatuation for the so-called black man. Even they understand that once brothers stop being so infatuated, so concerned with the opinion not only of the so-called white man, but of the other races, period, and more concerned about building from within, that is when their society is going to start to fall incrementally, because it really is being held up on the bent over back of the so-called black man. There are so many layers of programming that have been embedded within the subconscious of brothers, of the so-called black man, that it's very difficult for him to even understand where to begin from to throw off these shackles. And it starts with programming like this. From a toddler age, always look to the Caucasian child for validation. I need him to be my friend. This is why they're making this go viral. And when you let this video continue, it's very obvious why they're propagating this image out all across the country and probably all across the world. Because it's very obvious that this young black boy was adopted by this man who's walking up the sidewalk, this Caucasian man, who is very clearly a homosexual. And when you hear the voiceover, it's clearly the voice of another male who happens to be quote unquote homosexual. If I'm wrong about that, I'm wrong about that. But I know what I'm listening to and I know what I'm seeing. And it's very obvious that's why they're doing it. Because they're trying to tear the black child away from the so-called black man in the same way that they're trying to use subliminal programming to tear the so-called black woman away from the so-called black man. Why is that? It's because the so-called black man is the enemy. Men, period, are the enemy in this society on the lowest rung or on the lowest level. But the so-called black man is the number one enemy. If you're not concerned about entertaining the masses as a sports star, a singer, a dancer, etc., then you must either join the military or go to prison. That's how they monetize you. Hopefully, you can become a homosexual or just become a pansexual or so open-minded that possibly anything will go. What they know is that once you accept that open-minded mentality, you're not going to try to reinstill the patriarchal mindset. And that is the only way that we're going to be able to throw off these mental and spiritual shackles. That's the only way. The so-called black man must turn back to the Most High in the spirit of truth. That's the only way that it's going to occur. Not being infatuated with getting hugs from people of other races. As so-called black men, we all know that it's very difficult for us to even find support or succor from other people of our own race. That is why they want us to be occupied with getting validation from people of other races, especially the Caucasian. But just getting back to the point, when I saw this video on certain social media outlets or on the internet or on YouTube, etc., when you look at the comment section, the number one commenter was who? That liberal black woman that so many of you quote unquote pro-black men spend so much time trying to kowtow to, trying to convert over to your cause. That's why I tell you, leave them alone. Leave the liberal black woman alone. She's not your friend. She's not your ally. Underneath all of her bluster about being pro-black and being an African queen and a goddess from Kemet and an empress from the motherland, all that bullshit. In reality, they know where their bread is buttered. The so-called woman of color knows that as soon as this current kingdom ends, she's going to have to go back to understanding that the so-called black man is her head, and for the most part, they would take death first. The liberal black woman believes that she is her own racial demographic. They do not want to associate with the so-called black man at all unless they're using him for his sperm. But once again, if you get a chance, listen to this entire video with these two young children running towards one another. You can hear a man's voice narrating this video, and no disrespect, it's obviously a homosexual. Just like this person walking up the block is obviously a homosexual. He's walking behind the little black boy who was running towards the Caucasian boy. So he obviously is the black boy's adopted parent. It is what it is. Anything goes in this society. But once again, so-called black man, please understand, the focus is to take your children away from you and to take your woman away from you. They only want you here as a worker and as someone who's going to inseminate the so-called black woman and bring more children into this society to act as workers and drones. That's it. Either you're here to entertain or you're here to be a low-level drone.
With arms wide open after spotting each other on the street. Maxwell's father, Michael, posted this video on Instagram. He says that the boys live a block away from each other, and he calls them partners in crime. I love that age.
Now, did you hear what she just stated? She said, I love that age. They're constantly trying to push this notion that children understand things at a higher level than adults. Now, those of us who read the Gospels, we know that Christ would often make the analogy of becoming like a child because you have to be born again. What does that mean? You have to have a clear mind. You have to have a pure mind. You have to be accepting of his doctrine, i.e. his milk, which represents knowledge. But it's from the viewpoint and the understanding of a grown man. You have to humble yourself. It doesn't mean that you become like a literal child. And again, there were so many liberal black females talking about how children know better and this and that, and how come we can't be like this. And their favorite statement is, children are taught hate. Hate is not something that naturally occurs. And it's very clear that they don't understand the concept of rulership. What we see here and the dynamic of this society is not so much necessarily about quote unquote hate. The Caucasian came to power not by exhibiting necessarily hate, but by understanding that in order for him to grab a foothold in this world, he had to conquer. And in order to maintain his power, he had to create a system, or at least allow himself to implement a system that was created by even higher level Caucasians, what we call the Caucasian Jews, that would allow him to benefit. You understand that? It's about self-preservation. Even from archaic times, different tribes or nations or groups of people would fight over land, i.e. natural resources. It wasn't necessarily an emotional thing. As each tribe was separated from one another for long enough, they started to develop different cultures. That's what banded them or bonded them together. They each had or developed a certain physical or phenotypical appearance that made them bond together even more. So when they went up against one another to make sure that they could maintain their land, i.e. their natural resources, they knew what it was that they were trying to preserve. That's how we have to approach it. You can't just look at two little 4-year-old kids hugging and say, how come we all can't be like that? Children don't have responsibilities. That's why their minds are not cluttered by the concept of what we call stress. You understand, brothers? I mean, that's what it's really about. And that's why my channel is geared towards the man. Because the woman is being taught that her emotional, nonsensical attempts at rationalizing this society are the way to go. It's almost like placing a 10-year-old child behind the wheel of a car and they've never been taught to drive. They're going to crash. You understand that? The women in this society are masquerading as mature adults, and they're really not. They're going to school trying to mimic men. They're being taught that they're smarter than men. And now the children and even grown men are being taught to think like women. And now adults are being taught to think like children. It's because we're coming down to the last phases of this society. And it's really about the elect, the small remnant, understanding what's going on and raising their level of mental acuity, raising their perceptual abilities so that they can preserve themselves and their families. That's what it's going to come down to. Because, brothers, if the mainstream liberal media wants to harp on the image of a 4-year-old so-called Caucasian boy running towards a 4-year-old so-called black boy and hugging, and that's supposed to be what we're aiming for in this society, any photographer or nature chronicler can show you a young wolf pup or a lion cub in the same enclosure as a young lamb or a young gazelle. But you put those same two animals in the same enclosure 5 years later and watch what happens. It's called maturation. It's called an understanding of what our roles in nature are. It's called the stress of having to feed myself. That is what a lot of the issues between the races in this society are about. This is modern day Babylon that we live in. Not just America, but the entire planet, because this is a global government. America just happens to be the militaristic capital of the global government. But once again, this is Babylon. This is the land of confusion. Things that should be common sense for people is an enigma for them to figure out. And it's just very strange to me. That's why I say that for the so-called black man, this is the Truman Show. This entire so-called reality is a facade. It's like a television program that's being played out. And yes, the other nations are forced to dwell in this program here with us because every nation has to fall under the same programming as the so-called black man to maintain the covering over the eyes of the so-called black man. Because they cannot risk telling the other nations what the truth about history is, with the understanding that the fewer people who know the secret means there's a less of a chance of it being divulged to the target. They know what we were when we ruled. They understand what the scriptures state about the fate of the so-called black man, and they're trying to delay their fate as long as possible. That's all it's really about. But anyway, once again, wokety woke blacks, they just want a hug from the white man. That's all it's about. It is what it is, but at the end of the day, we have to learn how to love one another and hug one another first. Because there's a reason why our people are at the bottom. It's not because we're not hugging the Caucasian man. It's because we're not hugging and loving one another. We have to build up that trust to understand that we can hug and support one another first by building back our culture. All these things are going to have to occur step by step and incrementally. First, we have to assess what this current quote-unquote pseudo-reality is about before we can go about trying to convert things back over to a calibration that's beneficial for us. So peace.